what we try to strive for is including the voice of the family into where they want their child to reach. And that is a challenge in education. The challenge also is that we as professionals have to acknowledge that the outside knowledge informs us. We are being educated as well, not only from the most relevant research, but also from what the family sees as what their need is for that child. And we look at transitions as being some of the barriers we have to do. We have kids who are coming in at 3.5, going to 21. We have kids going from middle school, high school. We have kids going to workforce, going to college. Also, they're going to be involved in programs such as children's mental health centers to get support. And what we're looking at TDSB is how do we integrate all those pieces in to talk about what the school can do, what the school struggles to do, and how do we get what we want to do. And that's always been a challenge for us, but we are an extremely large board. And some of the things that I'm talking about have to be more micromanaged, and that's a challenge. We have edicts and plans and orders to follow, but also we have to follow what the teacher wants, also based on culture, language, religion, and what they understand about autism. And for us, some of the challenges that we're facing is that some of our students coming in are being diagnosed early, but the parents don't have the knowledge of what autism is. And we are on the forefront of explaining to what is autism, also explaining what education is, and explaining what the trajectory can be, and connecting to the services. And we've been striving as much as possible how to integrate those services within our framework and coordinate those services and not be heavy-handed when we say to kids away from school, or heavy-handed and say this is just the education piece. We're striving to make sure that we're more integrative in how we work with the families.
Well, I think in terms of challenges, so I think language is a huge barrier in terms of accessing services. And within the board, we have now a phone system where we access translators for every meeting, and that's been very helpful. But language is an issue often when there is a parent who has a second language or doesn't speak English well, and accessing the services outside in the community, and then that's where most of the challenges for social workers are often, accessing those services. Transportation is a huge issue for a school board like TDSB, which is a big board, and helping ease on that transition for students who have difficulties with transitions. And having qualified drivers and to be able to understand the engagement that has to happen. The other challenges are all around increasing capacity within the board, and how, because it's such a huge board, we have about approximately 3,500 students identified with autism in our board, and we are the third large board in North America. So just the challenges of getting new teachers trained and new staff trained, and looking at the whole process and how the school board procedures work, in looking at the IEP, how the IEP sort of plays a role in terms of building independence with SMART goals, and how the teachers can lead that and doing that training us with special education, with the special education department. So it's a huge challenge in how to get that across and deliver that program. So part of the school piece is through the school team meeting, school special SST, student supports team, which is a multidisciplinary team in each school, is to really access those kids that need that help, and try to engage the parents in that context. It starts at the school level.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to open, thank you to all of you. Probably everyone in the room probably can have a story about what didn't work well in a school. So we're happy to hear really what you are aspiring to provide in terms of programs and services, quality ones, high expectations for all students, and how do you integrate cultural responsiveness into your good practices? Now, we know some of the barriers. We know that you'll have what will be called competing legislation between special education, Ontario Human Rights Code, the labor legislation, and health and safety. So we know those are still barriers that need to be removed, because again, a personal bias of mine is they might seem incompatible, but they're not irreconcilable. And I think those are huge issues that parents end up facing. They may not know it, but they do when their children aren't in school or aren't in, or they're asking for the regular ed placement and being told there's not enough educational support, all those things that go on. Anyway, I'm going to open it up to anybody that would like to direct a question. Right at the back there. Do you need a microphone?
I think I can shout.
Okay. Sounded good from here.
Okay. So I wanted to actually commend Toronto District School Board, because they do a lot of race-based statistics already. I know many of us are working towards doing student censuses for next year. And I guess one of the things I've respected about Toronto is they've released those statistics to the public, and we found that there's evidence to say that it's not quite equitable across race, exceptionalities, placements, those kinds of issues, where a student is placed, what stream or pathway they end up with. So I'm just wondering how these three boards' equity frameworks are going to address the intersectionality of race, culture, and ableism.
That's a great question. I don't know if it's still on the TDSB website, the research that was done. I'll call courageous research that really they needed to identify. Not everybody knows in a big system what their practices look like, but there was, it was right in their face. Racialized minorities with special education needs find themselves much more in quick placements and segregated placements than other students, and lots of different kinds of ways of disaggregating the data that they went through. So if you haven't read it, I'm trying to think. Jillian Parak and Rob Brown was your research officer. If you haven't seen it, I think that's wonderful that you mentioned that, because they're doing it, or they've started to do it.
Just as a mom of a person on the spectrum, I was able to fight that practice, and I don't know that everybody would have maybe the same power and privilege I had to be able to do that.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if everybody can speak to where their board is at in terms of that, but if you can, give it a minute.
Well, I think this year, and I'm really not the person to speak about this because I'm just a social worker in the board. But this year's the mandate for the director is on equity, and that's the main focus for this year in looking at differentiating instruction within the classroom. I just mentioned what's good for some, what's good for all, for some, and for a few, and that's through in the context of a classroom and looking at how that differentiated instruction can be put in place. Before we actually access any other more intensive supports, and looking at the strengths and needs of the student, and how getting them to participate within the school community. But again, it's a challenge, as we acknowledge, and it has been in research. So I think that's where the board's direction is. So at this point, it's really looking at equity across the school board.
So maybe in the context of the question, for us, you mentioned the data that's being collected, certainly in Toronto, and when you have that data, then you have to address it. You have to do something about it. So when you have that, it's like when you do a survey, you got to live with what the data says, and then you need to make a plan moving forward. I guess for us, what I could say would be certainly in also following a lot of what Toronto was doing in terms of some of the things that were coming out. Students that were in behavior classes, students who were suspended, that sort of data. For us, it really helped us to move toward really being intentionally transparent about our practices and processes, so that there is less subjectivity in terms of recognizing, maybe an easy example, but when in some boards the practice was, it's a teacher nomination for something like a gifted class, which is entirely subjective. Moving toward practices that are grounded in transparent and defendable practices. that are clear to everyone, and this certainly helps us as we move along the way. I think we have a lot of work to do as everyone does, and that's something we certainly acknowledge. But that's certainly something that's helped us within the context of your comment about your advocacy on your end, and when it comes to how we're identifying students, what programs are available, how do we determine who the services that we provide. That the clear, equitable process part really does help us to go back to the ideas that when we do things on purpose, but for purposes that we can defend.
You want to answer that? You don't have to, not everybody has to answer
Okay.
the same question, but if you feel you
I know
can.
we're running out of time, so that's good.
Okay, any other questions? And you can direct them to a specific panelist. One, two. Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned being mindful of language when you talk to families, for example, about cutting back on services. I was wondering, are resources and funding issues, is that one of the reasons why positions or our services are cut? And if so, are we transparent to families about that?
Did everyone hear the question? Okay. So it was the idea that being clear about our financial, like if we're making decisions that are based on student need, are financial implications a part of decision-making process, and if they are, is that communicated to parents? I'm going to give you my perspective. That's all I can give you. First of all, we would always say, and I stand by this. When we talk about allocation of our needs, it's based on what students tell us. And the students, so we don't allocate based on only have this much money. It's when we go through that independence rubric process, that student is telling us how much services they need. What we found is that when we really did a hard look at how we were allocating our resources for something like an educational assistant, we were going to be frank with ourselves, and we were over-supporting. We had students who we thought we could find ways in which we had students. I'm going to give you a storyteller now for a second. Is that okay? Yeah. So we were doing this process called instructional rounds, which we do in our board. And we would go out, and you're looking at practices in different classrooms. Make a long story short, I go into a classroom with the team, and the teacher's teaching, and we're looking at practices, and there's an educational assistant in the room. And you might assume, or you'd think that maybe that you're the best version of yourself when the superintendent of special education's in the room and the EA's there. So there was a group of students, and I didn't see the student's IEP, but there was a student that I would guess, if that's okay to do so, would be on the spectrum somehow. And there was a group of 5 students who were sitting in groups who were doing their work. And the students were very appropriately prompting the student about next and that sort of peer engagement, and the EA was standing over the group, essentially parroting what the students were doing a really good job doing. And to me, I'm thinking that's a tremendous amount of resources that's in the classroom that could be utilized in different ways if we've got some great peer moderation. So it's just an example for me of thinking that we can use our resources better. So when we're taking a look at what students need, we are one of the boards. We're still growing. Like I think Milton grew by like 300% the last few years. So our students, we keep getting more and more students, but our need for when we use our independence rubric for more educational assistance has remained fairly static, going up very marginally. We will hit a key. We're kind of there actually right now, where we've been as efficient as we can. And as students continue to dictate to us what their needs are, then now I'm putting it into the budget. So I would say my answer to you, if you're a parent in the school, we are never going to be. I say this pretty confidently actually. If your son or daughter needs a certain amount of support, I won't say to you that we don't have the money to do it. A parent keep saying the same thing over and over again. We do things on purpose for purposes we can defend. So we have students in our system that have multiple educational assistants. Their needs are so complex, but we're always working toward independence. So our financial realities don't dictate the allocation of resources as much as student needs dictate the allocation of resources, and I'm very comfortable saying that to parents.
If I can just add, because I understood the question maybe a little bit differently. every board receives a special education envelope of money that has to be spent on special education. What is so encouraging about what we're hearing is if everybody is using the overarching umbrella of inclusive education, equity, and access, then the board itself, because I've been there, has to look at everybody's money, regular ed, for cultural, linguistic differences. So you don't rely just on the special education pot of money. That's when we'll truly arrive. There's lots of work that still needs to be done, but if you're looking at it under inclusive education, equity, and access, then you're not limited and constrained by the special education envelope. That's where everybody's going to come together.
Can I make a comment on that too, maybe
Yeah.
for the group that's really important to recognize, because spec ed is always reported as being over budget. Every board in the province would recognize spec ed as being over budget. Well, spec ed is funded in a particular way through 6 different envelopes you can't spend, like that's your spec ed budget, and then you report back to the ministry on how you use that money. But you're also funded per pupil. Spec ed kids count as being per pupil. So when we say that we're reaching into the, that we are over budget because we are using money that's not from the spec ed budget, that's from our general grant for student needs money. That is intended for students with special needs. So spec ed departments across the province are not spendthrifts. We will very intentionally take that money because it is what it's for. So I want to be I'm happy to share that with people in here because it's always reported that spec ed is underfunded and over budget. The GSN accounts for students with special needs. And students with special needs are entitled to that money through the GSN.
Did anybody else want to, Story, address the question of language? Okay, then we had another one at that table. Go ahead. And I see you at the back. Don't worry.
So I have a question in terms of like when we talk about supporting children, whether it's within healthcare or education, then the parents play a big role in how that care is addressed, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education. So in each of your roles as social workers, as consultants, and as superintendents within your wards, is there anything, rather, what is being done on a policy or regulation level, as well as what does it look like in terms of practice with regards to parent engagement? Dr. Sberry, in his talk, he spoken about how you have to start with where the family is at. What does that look like in your day-to-day experiences with the parents?
Okay, I'm going to let TDSB or York Region start here, if they want to. Because parent engagement is just a massive piece of this. Okay. Hi.
I knew it would be a messy question, but I had to ask. I'm a parent.
Me too. I'm also a teacher in an ASD classroom, and I also loved this morning. I feel like we need to honor more, creating those spaces to have those conversations with parents, to really bring them in to the process. At our board, we rely very heavily on in-school teams, where we bring the interdisciplinary people together, all the stakeholders, including parents, but really being careful and intentional of what questions we ask. And that's what I got from this morning. Creating those spaces where parents can brag about their kids, talk about their kids, what are their dreams for their kids, what are their kids all about, where do they want to see their children. Part of what we were doing at York Region is the after-school social skill program. And the way we started that process was bringing parents in and interviewing them to say, what goal do you want? Where is your child going to benefit most from these hours after school? What do you want to see as the outcome? And I think that made the whole process so authentic. And as a leader, and also to have some of my students in those classes, the benefit was tremendous because we were feeling it in the classroom amongst teachers and throughout the school climate, but also could hear it from parents, that they were seeing it at their swimming lessons, and they were seeing it at the dentist office or on the bus. Whatever that goal was, to initiate conversation, to independence, huge one we've heard today. I really do believe that we're on that road where we know we want to honor parents, we know parents are stakeholders, we work so well as a team, but really opening up those spaces to really be a team in the most authentic way.
Okay, I'm gonna have to have TDSB close if they want. I know there's other questions, but I invite you to see the panels where
I just want
I
to
have
address
to
the
give you a
parent
washroom
engagement.
break and then off to the next choice of featured speakers. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah, just the parent engagement piece is one of the, as part of the new mandated goal for the school board in general, parent engagement is a huge piece. I think as a board, I think that we're starting to get to some of those. I'm a parent from the TDSB as well, so I can see the changes now. There is a whole communication system that goes to all parents, informing about new changes, and the parent conference is happening soon, where everybody is informed of this, and everybody gets an email, which is incredible. At that level, but also at the school level, the school support team, as a part of the policy, has the parent to be invited when the children are discussed, and if there is translation included in there, if there's needed for second language needs. And then there is the piece of the parent engagement when we need to access other services, and then the social worker gets involved within the school to engage the parent and to work on other needs, not necessarily about their child with autism, but about poverty issues or any accessing funding or transportation or after school care. So all of the things that are pressing needs sometimes that are not related necessarily to their child with autism, but for daily living. So we start there. We start where the parent is at and engaging the parent to access the services within the school as well, and looking at, educating as well how the system works and how advocating within their school board what their needs are and how to go about getting those needs met. So using the school as the starting point, it's for the parent. From a parent perspective, it's the start and knowing how the system works around accessing the services that are needed. And it starts at the school steam meeting at the school level, and that's where it starts.
Just because we've run out of time, we could do this forever. I have to thank the panelists for rising to this challenge of answering very challenging questions. I know, having served on many panels, you're going to leave here and say, I know what I could have said, right? You're going to forget all, but this is just the beginning conversation, and I can't thank you enough because they were difficult questions, and you answered beautifully. Thank you.